It was supposed to be a quiet morning in a small southern town, a town with deep roots, unspoken rules, and a long memory. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, your business, and how you took your coffee. The kind of place where tradition held a tight grip on the present, often dragging old prejudices right along with it. But on this particular day, something was about to happen that would shake this town to its core, leaving scars that neither time nor apologies could fully heal. Two officers, both dressed in crisp blue uniforms that gleamed in the early sunlight, leaned casually against their patrol car. They were laughing, loud, carefree, the kind of laughter that comes when you're so comfortable in your world that you don't even question if it's right. Nearby, a lone man stood, arms restrained behind him, his face calm but his eyes scanning the street as if searching for something. Or someone. He wasn't from around here. That much was obvious. His dark skin and polished appearance stood out against the rough edges of the small town's everyday life. His presence, though silent, seemed to ripple through the atmosphere, challenging something unspoken. The officers didn't ask his name. They didn't bother with small talk or even the pretense of following protocol. To them, he was just another stranger passing through, a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of the officers, a tall, heavy-set man with a badge that looked almost too small for his chest, smirked as he grabbed a length of rope from the trunk. "Let's have some fun," he said, his voice dripping with a mix of arrogance and something darker. His partner, younger but no less eager, nodded, pulling the man toward a utility pole on the edge of the street. The man didn't resist. He didn't yell or plead. He just walked with them, his expression unreadable, his silence unnerving. The officers laughed again as they tied his hands to the pole, their voices carrying down the quiet street. "Think he'll learn his place now." One of them joked, wiping sweat from his brow. Passers-by glanced over but quickly looked away, their steps quickening as if ignoring it would make it less real. The man's silence wasn't submission, though. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, something the officers couldn't see because they didn't bother to look. But if they had, they might have noticed the flicker of recognition in his eyes when a black SUV rolled into view, its windows tinted and its engine humming with quiet authority. They might have caught the slight shift in his posture, the hint of a smile that never quite reached his lips. Inside the SUV sat a woman in a sharp suit, her face unreadable as she watched the scene unfold. She didn't rush out or shout. She simply parked, opened the door, and stepped onto the pavement with a confidence that seemed to make the air around her crackle. The officers turned toward her, their laughter fading, their postures stiffening as if instinctively aware that their morning had just taken a turn they hadn't anticipated. "Morning, officers," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that sliced through the tension. "I believe you've made a mistake." The officers exchanged glances, confusion clouding their faces. "Ma'am, this isn't your concern," one of them said, his tone dismissive. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge that gleamed even brighter than their uniforms in the sunlight. "This is your new chief," she said, her words landing like a thunderclap. "And you've just tied him to a pole." The silence that followed was deafening. The officers' faces drained of color, their laughter long gone, replaced by something that looked an awful lot like fear. And the man, still tied to the pole, finally spoke. His voice was steady, his words measured, but his eyes burned with a quiet fire that promised this wasn't the end. "Untie me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But what happened next would change everything, not just for these officers, but for the entire town. The younger officer fumbled with the knot, his hands trembling as he tried to loosen the rope that bound the man to the pole. His older partner, usually so sure of himself, stood frozen, his face a mix of disbelief and dawning dread. The woman in the sharp suit didn't move, her badge still held firmly in one hand. She kept her eyes locked on the two officers, watching their every move like a hawk circling prey. The man asterisk, their new chief asterisk, remained silent as the rope fell away. He rubbed his wrists, his expression calm but unreadable, as if he were holding back a storm just beneath the surface. The street was quieter now, though a few onlookers lingered, pretending not to watch but unable to look away. The black SUV sat idling nearby, its engine a low growl that seemed to echo the tension in the air. The woman spoke first, her tone steady but cold enough to cut through the oppressive heat of the morning. "You two will report to my office immediately after your shift," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And you'd better hope you have an explanation worth hearing." She glanced at the man, her boss, before adding, "Though I doubt it'll make much difference." The younger officer stammered something incoherent, but the older one managed to mutter a weak, "Yes, ma'am." They both avoided looking at the man as he stepped away from the pole, his presence towering even without a word. The woman turned to him then, her sharp features softening just a fraction. "Are you okay, Chief?" she asked, her voice quieter now. He nodded once, brushing a speck of dirt off his sleeve. "I'm fine," he said simply, his deep voice carrying a calm authority. "Thank you, Deputy Simmons." She nodded back, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Concern, maybe, or anger. "I'll follow up," she said, glancing at the officers again before heading back to the SUV. The man didn't move for a moment, standing there as if anchoring himself to the ground. Then, without looking back at the two officers, he turned and walked down the street, his footsteps steady and deliberate. The town's newest police chief had arrived. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Miles Carter had spent his life navigating spaces where he didn't quite belong, or where people thought he didn't. Growing up in the city, he learned early on how to carry himself, how to command respect without demanding it, how to let silence speak louder than words when necessary. Those lessons had served him well through decades in law enforcement, climbing the ranks one calculated step at a time. He wasn't naive, though. He knew what his promotion to police chief in this small southern town really meant. On paper, it was a reward for years of dedication and impeccable service. In reality, it was a test, both for him and for the town. The city council had been under pressure for months, facing scrutiny over outdated policies and a lack of diversity within the police department. Hiring Miles, the first black police chief in the town's history, was supposed to be a step forward, a symbol of progress. But symbols only went so far, especially in a place where old habits died hard. Miles had been in town less than a week before the incident with the officers. He'd arrived quietly, without fanfare, opting to settle into the role without drawing too much attention. The town had been polite enough on the surface, smiling faces at the diner, nods of acknowledgement on the street. But there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that people were watching, waiting to see how things would unfold. He hadn't expected to make enemies on his first week, but he wasn't surprised either. In fact, he'd been prepared for worse. What he hadn't expected, though, was the way those two officers had looked at him, not just with arrogance, but with a casual indifference, as if tying a man to a pole was just another part of their day. It wasn't the act itself that disturbed him most, it was the ease with which they'd done it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Deputy Simmons found him later that afternoon, sitting in his temporary office at the station. The room was sparsely decorated, with bare walls and a desk that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the 80s. Miles sat behind it, a stack of paperwork in front of him, though it didn't look like he touched it. He glanced up as Simmons knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Come in," he said, his tone neutral. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Simmons was sharp, quick on her feet, both physically and mentally. And Miles had taken notice of her during his first briefing with the department. She seemed out of place here too, though for different reasons. Where most of the officers carried themselves with a kind of resigned complacency, Simmons radiated energy, as if she were constantly braced for something to happen. "I wanted to check in," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "And to apologize." Miles raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not stepping in sooner," she said, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "I should have stopped them the moment I saw what was happening." He leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "You did what you could," he said finally, "and you showed up when it mattered. That counts for something." Simmons nodded, though her jaw tightened slightly. "I've seen things like that happen before," she admitted, her voice lower now. "Not just here, other places I've worked. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's blatant. But it's always there, under the surface." Miles nodded, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They both knew what she was talking about. "There's more to this department than what you've seen so far," Simmons added after a moment. "Some good people. But there are others who've been here too long, who think they're untouchable. It's going to be an uphill battle." "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't ready for that," Miles said simply. "But I appreciate the heads up." She hesitated, as if debating whether to say more, but then nodded and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, glancing back at him, "I'm glad you're here, Chief." Miles gave her a small nod, and she left, closing the door softly behind her. By the time the officers arrived at his office that evening, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. They shuffled in reluctantly, their earlier bravado replaced by nervous tension. Miles didn't look up immediately, letting them stand there for a moment while he finished writing something on a notepad. When he finally did lift his gaze, his expression was calm but firm. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the two chairs in front of his desk. The older officer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, Chief." Miles held up a hand, cutting him off. "You'll speak when I ask you to," he said, his voice steady but unyielding. "Right now you listen." The younger officer fidgeted in his seat, his eyes darting around the room. The older one clenched his jaw but stayed silent. Miles leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk. "What you did today wasn't just unprofessional, it was inexcusable," he said, his tone measured but sharp. "And it's not going to happen again. Not on my watch." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "You have one chance to explain yourselves. Choose your words carefully." The room felt heavy with tension as the officers glanced at each other, the weight of their actions finally sinking in. But as one of them began to speak, Miles noticed something. A flicker of defiance in the older officer's eyes, a hint that this wasn't over. And that's when Miles realized the battle ahead might be even harder than he'd thought. The older officer, whose badge read Harris, leaned back in his chair, his body stiff but his expression guarded. His partner, Officer Green, shifted nervously, looking like he wanted to melt into the background. Harris' lips pressed into a thin line before he finally spoke. His voice was steady but tinged with a quiet defiance. "Chief, we didn't mean anything by it," Harris said, the words almost practiced. "It was just a joke. Things get slow around here sometimes, and we—" Miles held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "A joke," he repeated, his tone calm but laced with steel. "You tied a man to a pole in broad daylight and called it a joke." Harris hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We didn't know you were." "That I was what?" Miles interjected, his voice rising just enough to make them sit up straighter. "Your superior, a human being. Explain it to me." The younger officer, Green, opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked to Harris, who glanced at him sharply, as if warning him to stay quiet. It was a small moment, but Miles caught it. There was a dynamic between the two, an unspoken hierarchy. Harris was in control, and Green followed his lead. "I'll tell you what I think," Miles said, his voice steady again. "I think you didn't bother to know who I was because, to you, it didn't matter. You saw a black man in this town, and you thought you could humiliate him without consequence. That's not a joke. That's abuse of power. And if you think I'm wrong, now's your chance to prove it." As the door clicked shut behind Harris and Green, Miles sat still for a moment, staring at the empty chairs across from him. His face remained calm, but his mind churned with possibilities. The tension in Harris' voice hadn't been just defensiveness, it had been something more dangerous. Resistance. Harris wasn't just one officer with a bad attitude. He was a symptom of something larger, something rooted deep within the department, and, likely, the town itself. Miles leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. He wasn't naive. He'd walked into this job knowing it wouldn't be easy. But moments like these made the weight of it feel heavier, pressing down like a storm cloud threatening to break. If Harris was willing to openly challenge him, who else in the department might be just like him, or worse? And what had Simmons meant when she'd said some officers thought they were untouchable? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Simmons stepped in, her usual confident demeanor slightly muted. She held a folder in her hands and gave him a look that told him she'd been listening, even if she hadn't meant to. "Thought you might want this," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "It's Harris' record. Figured you'd be curious." Miles opened the folder, flipping through the pages. Harris's file was thick, a mix of commendations for his time on the force and a series of complaints that had all mysteriously gone nowhere. Excessive force, intimidation, racial bias. Each one was labeled unsubstantiated or resolved internally. Miles frowned, the pattern painfully familiar. "And Green?" he asked, glancing up. "Clean record," Simmons said. "But he's new. Only been on the force a couple of years, and Harris has taken him under his wing. You can guess how that's going." Miles nodded, closing the folder. Harris is more than just a problem. He's a liability, and he's not acting alone. Simmons hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "There's been talk around the department since you got here. Harris doesn't like change, and he's got friends who feel the same way. I think they're testing you." Miles considered this, his jaw tightening. "If they're testing me, they're not going to like the results." Simmons gave a small nod, her expression serious. "Just be careful, Chief. Harris isn't the type to back down quietly." After she left, Miles sat in silence, the weight of her words settling over him. Testing him. Of course there were. He'd expected resistance. But the thought of Harris having allies within the department made the challenge even more complicated. If Harris and others were willing to undermine him, this wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about the culture of the entire department. That night, the town seemed quieter than usual, the streets empty except for the occasional car passing through. Miles stayed late at the station, poring over files and reports, trying to piece together the web he was stepping into. He barely scratched the surface when the phone on his desk buzzed. "Chief Carter," he answered, his voice steady. The voice on the other end was low, almost hesitant. "Chief, it's Green." Miles straightened in his chair, surprised. "Officer Green, what can I do for you?" There was a pause, and then Green spoke quickly, as if afraid he might lose his nerve. "I need to talk to you. About today. About everything." Miles's brow furrowed. "All right. Where are you?" I'm at home," Green stammered. "But I can meet you somewhere. I don't want anyone to know." The tension in Green's voice was palpable. Miles glanced at the clock. It was well past 10, but something in Green's tone told him this couldn't wait. "I'll meet you," Miles said. "Where?" Green suggested a diner on the edge of town, one that stayed open late, but rarely had many customers. Miles agreed, grabbed his keys, and headed out. The night air was thick and humid as he drove, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty roads. His mind raced, turning over possibilities. If Green was reaching out, it meant he was feeling the pressure. But was it guilt, fear, or something else entirely? When Miles arrived at the diner, Green was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as Miles approached, his face pale and his hands fidgeting nervously. "Chief," Green said, his voice barely above a whisper. Miles slid into the booth across from him, keeping his tone calm. "What's on your mind, officer?" Green glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "I shouldn't even be here," he said. "If Harris finds out—" "You're here," Miles said firmly. "That tells me you've got something to say." Green took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Look, I didn't know what Harris was planning today. I swear, he just told me to follow his lead. That's how it always is with him. He doesn't explain. He just expects you to do what he says." "And you do," Miles said, his voice even. Green flinched but nodded. "I thought it was just another one of his power trips. He likes to mess with people, make them feel small. But when I saw it was you, I wanted to say something, but I didn't know how to stop it. Harris doesn't take no for an answer." Miles studied him for a moment. "You're here now," he said. "Why?" Green hesitated, his eyes darting around the room again. "Because it's not just Harris. There are others. They're planning something. I don't know all the details, but Harris keeps talking about how things are going to go back to the way they were. He's got a group of guys who think you're trying to change too much, too fast. They're not happy, Chief, and I think they're going to do something about it." Miles' expression didn't change, but inside, his anger simmered. "What do you mean? Do something. Be specific." Green shook his head, his hands trembling. "I don't know. He doesn't tell me everything. But there's been talk about making you regret coming here, about showing you who's really in charge." The words hung in the air like a warning, the weight of them pressing down on Miles. He leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "You listen to me, Green. Whatever they're planning, it ends now. You understand. If you know anything else, anything at all, you tell me." Green nodded quickly, his fear evident. "I'll try," he said. "But if Harris finds out—" Miles stood, his presence towering over the younger officer. "If you're serious about doing the right thing, you won't have to worry about Harris. I'll handle him." As Miles walked out of the diner, the weight of the conversation settled over him like a storm cloud. The battle ahead wasn't just about enforcing rules or cleaning up a department. It was about dismantling a system built on fear and loyalty to the wrong things. And if Harris and his allies thought they could scare him off, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. As Miles stepped out into the humid night air, his mind churned. Green's words replayed in his head. They're going to do something about it. It wasn't a revelation that Harris had a following, but the idea that they were actively plotting was a new level of escalation. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly behind him as he stood by his car, trying to piece together the next move. He couldn't act without more information, but waiting felt like giving Harris and his allies the upper hand. The drive back to his place was uneventful, but Miles couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed sharper, every passing car slower. By the time he pulled into his driveway, his nerves were taut. He scanned the street, his eyes lingering on the dark windows of parked cars and the quiet homes lining the block. Nothing seemed out of place, but the tension clung to him like a second skin. Inside, the house was dark, and still the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. Miles locked the door behind him, checking it twice before heading to the small desk in the corner of the living room. He opened his laptop, pulling up department rosters and old case files. If Harris was the ringleader, Miles needed to know who else was in his circle and what skeletons might be hiding in their closets. The hours slipped by as he dug through records, his search turning up a troubling pattern. Harris and a handful of others had worked together on several cases with one common thread: complaints of misconduct, excessive force, intimidation, unlawful searches. None of it had gone anywhere, of course, but the names attached to those complaints painted a clear picture. Harris wasn't just a bad apple. He was part of a rotten barrel. Miles's phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. The screen lit up with a text from Simmons. "Chief, you might want to see this. Turn on Channel 6. He grabbed the remote, flipping on the TV to the local news. A reporter stood in front of the police station, her voice crisp and urgent. Behind her, a small crowd had gathered, holding signs that ranged from demands for accountability to outright hostility toward the department. Tonight, tensions are running high in Oak Ridge as allegations surface about misconduct within the local police department, the reporter said. Anonymous sources claim that the new police chief, Miles Carter, is facing resistance from within his own ranks, with some officers reportedly planning to undermine his authority. Miles's stomach sank. Someone had leaked it. Someone who wanted to turn the town against him before he could even get his footing. The screen shifted to a pre-recorded segment, a shaky video showing Harris and another officer, Green, laughing outside the station. The timestamp was recent, likely from earlier that evening. "This is our town," Harris was saying in the video, his tone smug. "We don't need anyone coming in here faking they can tell us how to do our jobs. Things worked just fine before, and they'll work just fine again once we straighten a few things out." Miles clenched his jaw, his anger bubbling to the surface. The message was clear, even if it wasn't explicit. Harris was emboldened, and now he'd taken his defiance public. But what stung more was that Green had been right there with him. Had his fear at the diner been genuine, or had it all been an act to throw Miles off the scent? The reporter's voice pulled him back to the screen. "The chief has not yet commented on these allegations, but community members are divided. Some are calling for a full investigation into the department, while others are questioning whether Chief Carter's approach is the right fit for Oak Ridge." The segment ended, cutting back to the live shot of the reporter, but Miles didn't hear the rest. His thoughts raced. This wasn't just about Harris anymore. It was about the narrative. Harris and his allies were trying to frame him as the outsider, the problem, before he could expose theirs. And now the town was watching, waiting to see who would come out on top. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. Miles hesitated, then answered, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "This is Chief Carter." A pause, then a low voice, almost a whisper. "You think you know what you're dealing with, but you don't. If you're smart, you'll pack up and leave before things get ugly." The line went dead before Miles could respond. He stared at the phone, his grip tightening. The threat wasn't subtle, but it also wasn't unexpected. What unsettled him was the Miles sat in the silence of his living room, the weight of the anonymous call settling over him. The voice had been deliberate, the words chosen to make it clear he was being watched, perhaps even followed. He knew the stakes had escalated. This wasn't just about Harris anymore. This was a network of people who believed they were untouchable, and now they were willing to cross a dangerous line to protect their power. Instead of reacting immediately, Miles took a deep breath and tried to think. Fear was what they wanted, fear to make him retreat. But retreat wasn't in his nature. His years in law enforcement had taught him how to stay steady in the face of chaos. He couldn't show weakness now, not with the department and the town watching his every move. He needed to act, and fast. By the time morning rolled around, Miles had a plan. He called Simmons into his office first thing. Her expression was grim when she walked in, a coffee cup in one hand and a file in the other. "You saw the news," she said, her voice low. Miles nodded. "And I got a little extra last night, a call, anonymous, a warning to back off." Simmons's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the cup. "They're getting desperate." Desperate, but still calculating, Miles said, "This isn't random. They're trying to frame me as the problem before I expose them. But we're not going to let them control the narrative." He slid a piece of paper across the desk toward her. It was a list of names, officers who had appeared in multiple complaints or had a pattern of working closely with Harris. "I need everything we've got on these guys," Miles said. "Files, reports, anything that's been buried. And I need you to do it quietly. If they catch wind of this, they'll lock everything down." Simmons nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm on it." As the day went on, Miles kept a low profile, reviewing files and making calls. By the afternoon, Simmons returned with a folder thicker than he expected. The patterns were clear. Harris and his group had operated unchecked for years, using their badges as a shield while intimidating anyone who dared to stand up to them. It wasn't just about isolated incidents. It was a culture that had been allowed to fester. But there was one name that stood out, a local businessman named Todd Bennett. His name appeared repeatedly in reports involving Harris and his circle. Complaints against him had vanished just as quickly as those against the officers. Miles dug deeper and discovered that Bennett had ties to the town council. The pieces clicked into place. Harris wasn't just protecting himself. He was part of a larger web of power and influence, one that extended beyond the department. That evening, Miles called a mandatory department meeting. Officers filed into the room, their expressions ranging from curious to tense. Harris sat near the back, leaning back in his chair with a smug look that made Miles's blood boil. Green was there too, looking pale and jittery, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Miles stood at the front, his presence commanding as he began to speak. "I called this meeting because we have a problem," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This department is supposed to serve and protect everyone in this town. But somewhere along the way, some of us forgot what that means. Instead of protecting, we've been intimidating. Instead of serving, we've been abusing our power. And that ends now." The room was silent, the tension thick. Harris smirked, leaning forward slightly. "Big words, Chief. Got anything to back them up?" Miles locked eyes with him, unflinching. "As a matter of fact, I do." He turned to Simmons, who stepped forward with a laptop. She connected it to the projector, and a series of documents and video clips appeared on the screen. Complaints, reports, and, most stunning of all, footage of Harris and others engaging in misconduct. The final clip was a recent one, showing Harris talking to Todd Bennett outside a bar, the audio capturing them discussing how to handle Miles. The room erupted in murmurs, but Miles raised a hand to silence them. "This isn't just about a few bad decisions," he said. "This is about corruption, plain and simple. And I'm not going to let it poison this department any longer." Harris stood, his face red with anger. "This is a setup," he shouted. "You don't know what you're talking about." Miles took a step closer, his voice calm but cutting. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, and I'm not the only one. Internal affairs is already involved. They've got everything they need to move forward, and you'll have your chance to explain yourself to them." The color drained from Harris's face as the weight of Miles's words sank in. He looked around the room, searching for support, but the other officers avoided his gaze. Even Green looked away, his guilt written all over his face. As Harris was escorted out by Simmons, the room was left in stunned silence. Miles turned to the remaining officers, his expression serious. "This is a turning point for us," he said. "We can rebuild this department and earn back the trust of the people we're supposed to serve. But it starts with accountability. It starts now." The officers nodded, some hesitantly, others with determination. Miles felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was turning. Later that night, as Miles sat in his office, his phone buzzed with another unknown number. He hesitated before answering, expecting another threat. But the voice on the other end surprised him. "Chief Carter," the voice said, calm and measured. "You've made some powerful enemies tonight. Be careful who you trust." Before Miles could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, a chill running down his spine. The fight against Harris might be over, but the war against the system he represented was far from finished. Miles sat in the quiet of his office, the events of the day weighing heavily on him. The fallout from the meeting had been swift. Harris had been detained for questioning, and Green had quietly handed in his badge, mumbling something about wanting a fresh start. Simmons had been instrumental, her steadfast support reminding Miles that not everyone in the department was compromised. But the anonymous call he received after the meeting lingered in his mind. The voice had been calm, almost clinical, but the message was clear. This was far from over. The next morning, the town was buzzing. News of Harris' arrest and the corruption scandal spread quickly, dominating conversations in coffee shops, schools, and businesses. Some people were shocked, others vindicated. Miles, however, was too focused on the work ahead to dwell on public opinion. He knew that cleaning up the department wasn't just about removing the bad apples. It was about rebuilding trust and proving to the community that change was possible. Simmons knocked on his office door, a stack of papers in hand. "The IA investigators are here," she said. "They started reviewing everything we sent over. Looks like Harris and his crew are going to have a lot of explaining to do." Miles nodded, grateful for her efficiency. "Good. The sooner they finish, the sooner we can focus on moving forward." She hesitated, then added, "Chief, there's something else. We found more ties between Todd Bennett and the town council. Nothing solid yet, but enough to suggest this goes deeper than just Harris." Miles sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Of course it does. Bennett's been playing puppet master for years, and Harris was just one of his strings. But without concrete proof, we can't touch him." Simmons looked like she wanted to argue, but held back. "What's the plan, then?" "The plan," Miles said, "is to focus on what we can control. Clean up the department, build transparency, and let Bennett know we're watching. He might think he's untouchable, but no one is above accountability forever." Simmons nodded, her respect for Miles evident in her steady gaze. "We'll get it done." Over the next few weeks, the department underwent a transformation. Miles instituted new policies emphasizing accountability and community engagement. He met with local leaders and residents, listening to their concerns and finding ways to bridge the divide that years of mistrust had created. Simmons became his right hand, her dedication and integrity earning her the respect of both colleagues and the community. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in the station began to shift. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to misconduct started speaking up, and those unwilling to adapt quietly moved on. One day, Miles received an unexpected visitor. An older woman with a kind but determined expression introduced herself as Mrs. Jenkins, the grandmother of a young man who had been one of Harris' victims. She held a small box in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I just wanted to thank you, Chief," she said, "for standing up to them, for making this town feel a little safer." Miles felt a lump in his throat as he shook her hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. That means a lot." She smiled and handed him the box. "This belonged to my grandson. He always believed in justice, even when the world seemed unfair. I thought you should have it." Inside the box was a small pin, a symbol of hope and perseverance. Miles promised himself he would carry its meaning forward in every decision he made. As the weeks turned into months, the department's reputation began to improve. Community events hosted by the police brought neighbors together, breaking down barriers that had existed for years. Miles often attended these events, not as a figure of authority, but as a member of the community. He played basketball with kids, listened to parents' concerns, and shared meals with families. It wasn't about grand gestures, it was about showing up and being present. But the shadows of the past weren't entirely gone. Late one evening, as Miles was locking up his office, he noticed a plain white envelope on his desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message: "Keep digging and you'll regret it." He sat down, staring at the note. It wasn't entirely unexpected. He knew his work had made him enemies. But instead of fear, he felt a quiet determination. The note wasn't a sign to stop. It was a sign that he was on the right track. The system wouldn't change overnight, and there would always be resistance. But progress was possible, even if it came in small, hard-fought steps. The final piece of closure came when Harris's trial began. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his smug confidence had crumbled under the weight of his actions. Green testified against him in exchange for leniency, revealing details about Bennett's influence and the extent of Harris's abuses. Though Bennett's name came up repeatedly, his involvement remained frustratingly indirect, leaving him free for the time being. But the trial sent a clear message. The days of unchecked power in Oak Ridge were over. One evening, long after the courthouse lights had gone out and the streets were quiet, Miles sat on his porch, reflecting on everything that had happened. The town had changed, and so had he. He wasn't naive. He knew there were more battles ahead. But he also knew he wasn't alone in the fight. People like Simmons, Mrs. Jenkins, and countless others had shown him that even in the face of corruption and division, there was strength in unity. As he sipped his coffee, he thought back to the moment he'd taken the job. He'd known it wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't anticipated just how deep the roots of the problem went. Now, months later, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead was still long, but the first steps had been taken. The sound of children laughing echoed down the street, and Miles smiled. Oak Ridge wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was moving in the right direction. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like it truly was a place worth fighting for.